Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I cannot share with you how pleased and excited I am to welcome each of you to this super important and timely conversation on the Supreme Court and affirmative action and what it might mean for small businesses and entrepreneurs. We know that wise counsel would not suggest predicting the actions of the courts. And I'm sure you all saw the news of this morning of the unexpected majority in Alabama voting rights case. And we know that in a very strict legal sense, the cases against Harvard and UNC currently before the court are about university admissions, not business and entrepreneurship. But we thought it was really important to bring this group together with two extraordinary legal minds and the leaders that they are to help us better understand what might be the implications of these cases on diverse businesses and entrepreneurs. So welcome. I'm Tammy Halevi, the Executive Director of Reimagine Main Street, a project of Public-Private Strategies Institute. And again, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all. This conversation is one in a long series of dialogues that our team and partners have been curating over the last 3 years. Reimagine Main Street is a network of extraordinary leaders across sectors and geographies, supported by data-driven insights.
Hi, nice to see you.
Tammy, you're on mute.
Thank you. All intended to ensure that small businesses and the people they employ on MLK Boulevards, Cesar Chavez Ways, Chinatowns, and Main Streets across the country have access to opportunities to thrive and contribute, grow their businesses and the economy. Before we move into the program, I want to take a moment to thank our amazing and extraordinary co-hosts for this roundtable. Your organizations are important, your leaders are phenomenal, and the group assembled on this call is a testament to your influence and reach. Thank you to our co-hosts, the Black Economic Alliance, NGLCC, the National Minority Supplier Development Council, the National Urban League, Public-Private Strategies, the U.S. Black Chambers, and the United States Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And of course, thank you to all of you who have joined us. Now, without further delay, I am delighted to hand the floor over to Samantha Tweedy, the CEO of the Black Economic Alliance, the nation's leading organization harnessing the collective expertise and influence of Black business leaders and allies to build generational wealth for the Black community. As a lawyer herself by training and a phenomenally thoughtful and effective leader and partner, there is no one better suited to lead this conversation with Professor Shaw. Sam, welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Tammy, and just would echo the huge thanks to all of the partners and co-hosts of today's event. I'm CEO of Black Economic Alliance, thrilled to have a number of our members and friends here. Ken, Ted, wonderful to see you. And hot off the press, you heard it here first, our soon to be announced newest member of the board of directors, Miss Benery Wiley. So without further ado, I do want to spend a moment just of real thanks to you, Professor Shaw. You are just one of the true titans of the civil rights movement and civil rights law. And I know I can speak on behalf of everyone on this screen and all of the folks who all the organizations on this screen represent when I say thank you, thank you, thank you. Your 25 years as an attorney with the NAACP LDF, being director, counsel, and president, now moving into the seat of Julia Sell Chambers, Distinguished Professor of Law and Director of University of North Carolina Center for Civil Rights. Your action, your thought, your strategic planning, all around issues of race and racism and how we move forward everywhere from Cape Town to Budapest, and of course here at home, is just something we all are incredibly grateful for. And your time spent in front of the United States Supreme Court makes you the perfect person for us to be having this conversation with today. So we're grateful. Thanks for being here with us.
Well, thank you so much.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say thank you so much. You're very kind. You know, as I often say, I'm just another pea in the pot of life. But you're very generous.
We'll let you say it, but we don't believe it. So as Tammy alluded to, asking you to read the tea leaves and predict the outcome of a Supreme Court decision is certainly a fool's errand. And we saw that today in the wonderfully unexpected ruling in the Alabama voting rights case is important to all of us in our work, certainly to the Business and Democracy Initiative that we are incredibly fortunate to be in partnership with Public-Private Strategies and Leadership Now project around. And so today we'll mostly be focused on what we think is going to happen with the affirmative action cases, but did just want to give you a moment to share with us your reflections on the decision today, Professor Shaw.
Well, thank you. Most of my professional life, most of my life as a lawyer, I have always declined to predict when asked what the Supreme Court is going to do. I have to say that in recent years, I've sometimes been tempted to move away from that practice because this Supreme Court has been consciously built for the moment in which we find ourselves. That certainly is true. Nonetheless, it has been, for the most part, a fool's errand to predict or try to predict with any certainty what the Supreme Court is going to do. And today's decision coming out of Alabama, Allen versus Milligan, once again tells us why it's a mistake to try to predict what the Supreme Court is going to do. Nonetheless, we still have a good sense of the direction of this court. It's the most conservative Supreme Court in the lifetimes of, I think, just about anybody who's alive now. But today's important decision tells us something. We're not entirely clear about what it tells us, certainly about the two Supreme Court cases that involve the issues of diversity and affirmative action. So, of course, as everyone knows, the Alabama case involved what's left of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, after the Supreme Court some years back basically gutted Section 5 by invalidating its operating formula, Section 4 of the 1964 Voting Rights Act as amended. What struck me today was that, among other things, I'm not sure I can remember another instance in which a voting rights case went to the court in which Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion and upheld the Voting Rights Act or whatever provision was being challenged. He has long been an opponent of the Voting Rights Act and an opponent of race consciousness. Today, significantly, he declined to take the opportunity as asked by the plaintiffs in the Alabama case to declare race consciousness in general, but in particular in the application of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to be illegal. He could have taken that opportunity and it would have overturned precedent, including the most important precedent applicable in this case, Jingles versus Thornburg. He expressly declined to do so. So maybe there's hope. Yet, in the penultimate sentence, I think, in the last paragraph, he does seem to remind us about the fact that the concerns about race consciousness in the Voting Rights Act seem to be saying they're not illegitimate. We're just not going to strike down, the Voting Rights Act in this case at this moment. Well, we've kind of heard that before in the case that preceded Shelby County versus Holder, the case involving the Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District, in which Chief Justice John Roberts sent up a warning flag to Congress saying, if you don't change this, we will. So I wouldn't be too smug about today, but nonetheless, we take our victories where we find them. And today, in fact, is a victory.
Amen. And I know there are a lot of folks on this screen who spend a lot of time thinking about the voting rights work as well. So I wouldn't be surprised when we get into questions if the question that comes back to you is, so what does this mean for our work? But knowing what the focus of our conversation is today, Professor Shaw, will you just share with us what your folks know about the affirmative action cases that we expect the decision to come down on in June? Again, can't predict the tea leaves, but what do you think is most important for us all to be aware of, particularly with regard to this focus on what the decisions may mean with respect to businesses, diverse businesses and entrepreneurs?
Well, first, I want to, without going too far down this rabbit hole, because I'm capable of doing that, I want to point out something that you bring to mind. You referred to what's up for grabs as affirmative action. And I want to point out that the Supreme Court, in my view, in the Bakke case in 1978, University of California at Davis Medical School, its deliberate efforts to admit Black and brown students to the medical school, Alan Bakke sues them, and he does prevail, but the court is splintered in so many different directions. It's not clear that there's one abiding rationale to support race-conscious admissions, but race consciousness does emerge from the Bakke case as permissible under very limited circumstances, and that becomes the basis for another 40 some odd years, almost 50 years.
Human.
But what came out of Bakke was Powell's opinion, and it bridged two camps in a very divided court. And Powell's opinion was about something that hadn't been talked about in race cases in the Supreme Court before, at least not that I can think of, but I've been thinking about this for a long, long time. And that was the diversity rationale, as opposed to affirmative action. Affirmative action began in the early 1960s as an effort to remedy the nation's long history of subordination, of racism, of discrimination. And affirmative action was a deliberate effort to remedy and address the impact of all of that history. That was affirmative action. And it was rooted in the interests of Black and brown people, primarily, but not exclusively, in the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, ratified in 1868. Diversity is a rationale that doesn't belong to Black and brown people. It belongs to institutions, colleges and universities. It's not based in the 14th Amendment. It's based in the First Amendment interest of these colleges and universities and academic freedom. So what I'm saying is that the Supreme Court all but killed affirmative action in the Bakke case. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund and a group of Black law professors at Howard University, Herbert O. Reed and company, and some other organizations that represented African Americans clearly argued for affirmative action as the primary rationale for race-conscious efforts to keep the doors of opportunity open, and talked about the 14th Amendment and its original intent. And the 14th Amendment and its original intent could not, Congress, the 39th Congress could not have intended that all race-conscious actions per se were inconsistent with the 39th Congress. The intent of the 39th Congress with the 14th Amendment. Because that same Congress adopted the Freedmen's Bureau, race conscious, adopted institutions like hospitals for African Americans, race conscious, schools for African Americans, race conscious. I could go on and on, but I think you get the point. Gave some land to some Black people, not enough, didn't last, but race conscious. And those arguments were ignored by the Supreme Court. You know, the Bakke case, I've talked about it, and I've defended diversity as a rationale, but as a secondary rationale, not the best rationale for opening the doors of colleges and universities to Black and brown people. In many ways, the diversity rationale is like what Hollywood did for a long, long time. It couldn't tell the story that purported to be about Black people and brown people. Couldn't tell those stories except through the eyes of white folk.
So when
if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. And so what that brings me to think about is when you apply what we expect may happen, or the range of what may happen in the upcoming decisions, with that historical context as the backdrop, and you look over to the corporate sector where we assume that because of the best interests and bottom line that diversity provides for corporations and businesses, how might these decisions that come down influence businesses' response?
Well, let me just say that in spite of what I just said about the original purpose of what's been race conscious admissions, which was affirmative action, diversity has held up, and institutions of all kinds have accepted and embraced diversity as a rationale for deliberately trying to be inclusive. Your question goes to a reality that, in spite of what I said, lifts up diversity and maybe not so much affirmative action, although I continue to think that was the original rationale. Altruism is a wonderful thing, I've come to say. I admire altruism, but self-interest is much more reliable. And corporations, the US military, institutions of all kinds, colleges and universities, figured out at some point that with the demographics of the country changing, corporations looking to customer bases and wanting to be able to attract all kinds of folks who are going to help their bottom line. Diversity. Look at the commercials on television these days. I mean, I often think, I don't know, maybe I ought not saying this, but I often think that there must be people sitting at home going nuts and crazy because of the world they grew up in which in these commercials, there were no Black and brown people. It was only white folks. And now you see these commercials and all these Black and brown people, and there are all these multiracial families, it's all about diversity, it seems. But that is not because of altruism. That's because this country has changed and is continuing to change. And if we don't find our way to continuing to be inclusive, the bottom line of a lot of institutions and the country's interests are going to suffer. And so that's what's up for grabs now, in addition to what has always been up for grabs, which is the fact that African Americans, for example, have long been subordinated and continue in many ways, in spite of all the progress that we've made, the Black president we've had, the African American, among other things, vice president that we have, et cetera. But nonetheless, we all know the story. Black folks, average wealth, Black families, average wealth, being somewhere under 10% still of what white wealth is, somewhere around 8% of white wealth. There's still a lot of work that remains to be done consciously, if it's going to be done. And to equate that work with racism is a crass distortion. It's wrong as a matter of principle, as a matter of fact, as a matter of history. That's all up for grabs right now with these two cases.
And I know another specific place that a lot of us have our eyes on is around government contracting, and whether there's implications from these decisions that could impact government contracting, thinking specifically about the potential chilling effect on government agencies. And so what are some potential implications we should be thinking about there?
Yeah. Well, I remember in 1989, when the U.S. Supreme Court decided the case out of Richmond, Virginia, the Croson case, J.A. Croson. And in addition to that, that was state and local efforts in contracting that were race conscious. In addition to that, the federal government, Adirondack, which went to the Supreme Court in 1995. And both those cases made it very difficult for localities, state and local government, but also the federal government to pursue conscious efforts to open up contracting to Black and brown people. And then there's another piece of that that had to do with women that had a very interesting twist that we could talk about, which made it easier in some respects to engage in affirmative action and contracting for women than for Black and brown folks. Let me be clear, I'm not opposed to affirmative action and contracting for women, but there was an interesting twist in all of that. Nonetheless, contracting efforts have survived. You have to be careful, as you do in any arena, when you engage in race conscious measures. And you have to create a record that justifies engaging in those efforts. And you have to periodically review the continuing necessity of those efforts. Otherwise, you make those programs vulnerable to legal challenge. But the bottom line is that these are efforts that have continued. If there is, as the Students for Fair Admissions, a Supreme Court decision that says that any race-conscious efforts are illegal, either on constitutional grounds or on statutory grounds, the reach will not be limited to higher education in all likelihood. Certainly, those who are opposed to race-conscious efforts to keep the doors of selective institutions in higher education open, they're not going to stop with higher education. They're going to go back to employment. They're going to go back to contracting. They're going to try to stop any and all deliberate efforts to keep those doors open. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said, see the Ruder case, see the two Fisher cases, that it has recognized the interests that corporations have, the military has in inclusiveness. It's a national necessity to be inclusive, but the efforts to strike down such efforts are going to be ongoing. Whatever happens in these two cases, it's not going to be the last word. It's not going to be over.
That's right. And given that expansive interpretation that we expect to be made of whatever the decision lands on, and given the leaders that we have with us in this conversation today, how would you encourage us all to be thinking proactively about the role that we can play, the urgency needed, the creativity needed for us to be as much as we can ahead of that?
Yeah, well, you know, in some ways it's a real challenge to get ahead of it because we don't know what the court's going to say until it comes down, notwithstanding the leak that happened in the Dobbs case last year. But we don't know. We don't know whether the court's going to flat out ban all race-conscious measures, or whether it's going to tighten the screws, leave it, the notion of diversity efforts intact, but make it so difficult to do that it basically is strangling the possibility of engaging in those efforts. And I think that it's going to be important. It is important for whatever happens, people not to panic and run, as some people are all too ready to do, and to try to figure out how to develop programs that will allow inclusiveness and efforts at inclusiveness and opportunity to continue. After the Hotwood case in Texas some years ago, challenging affirmative action and diversity efforts in higher education, Texas came up with the 10% plan. Well, you know, there are those who may be targeting 10% plans, but they've been in place a long time and courts have allowed them to continue. I've been thinking, and we have to think creatively. So let me just put this on the table. For example, you know, the most obvious way to try to address exclusion and racial inequality is to do it consciously and straight up do it. And it's ridiculous that people suggest that we shouldn't be able to do that because they advance this false equation between efforts to do that and racism. I mean, that's nonsense. But if the court adopts that approach, at the same time, I think we need to think about creative approaches. Like, think about what has been the impact of all of the hundreds of years of exclusion and subordination on grounds of race, and what that has done, what it has left us. So, for example, I mentioned the difference between family wealth, white family wealth being, so much higher than Black family wealth. $8 for every, 200 and something dollars that white family wealth has. But we can think about developing programs that assist people who come from backgrounds where family wealth is virtually non-existent, and try to address programs to people from those backgrounds, people who come from communities that have been deprived of resources, that have been, in one way or another, communities where opportunity doesn't come knocking on the door, and try to reach folks in those communities. It's not a perfect fit, but we have to think about that in other ways of defining what we're trying to do, in ways that make it more difficult for people to say all you're doing is it's on the basis of skin color and nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Am I making sense?
Completely. I know we have a bunch of folks who are waiting to jump in the conversation. So let's turn and open it to Q&A, and then we can come back together just to close out on this point of what we can do and where we can go from here. So folks, if you have a question, just use the chat function to raise your hand, and we'll be looking around. But we'll start with Mr. Ron Busby, President and CEO of the U.S. Black Chambers and a co-host of our conversation today. Ron?
Thank you. And Professor, man, I'm just excited to hear your words. At the U.S. Black Chamber, we fight on behalf of Black-owned businesses. And I say that because so often when we're talking about programs being attacked, we use the words minority, and then I hear you talk about Black and brown. But then when we talk about minority, that's a big bucket. And so I heard Samantha ask the question, what should we be doing? But it always seems that it leads on the backs of Black and brown people to make America the greatest country that it can be. And for it to be a great country, we need all of us fighting together, both Black, brown, Asian, Hispanic, white, gay, women, all of us, because when it is attacked, it's attacking the country's core. You made the comments that the country is great because of the diversity and inclusion that it has, but many times it seems as if it's the Black and brown communities that are fighting the most, that are getting the least, and have the most to lose. But in fact, the country has a lot to lose when the programs that are being attacked. What can we, before we got on, we were talking about, man, we feel like we are fighting to keep up with the 60 years of progress that we've made, and we're at the wheel and everyone else is asleep. We are out of gas, the engine light is blinking, out of oil, tires on flat, and everybody's just saying, hurry up and get there. We've got to make sure that we are looking at the situation at hand to make sure that we're not asleep at the wheel, because as it's been stated, we know that it's coming next. We have seen the 8A program under attack, and many Americans have benefited from that program. But what we're saying is intentionality, transparency, and accountability. For the first time, we heard the federal government talk about what was being spent with Black communities, brown communities, and Asian communities, and it was embarrassing. But it was the first time the country heard the small amounts that we were getting. So even with the small amounts that we're receiving, those are being attacked. I want us to be able to leave here with some type of plan of action to be able to say, okay, we know that it's coming. We've got to make sure that we are arming ourselves with enough ammunition and at least a strategy to be able to say, we are looking around the corner, because I don't want to be at the helm of the Black Chamber in 2050. And we were saying, well, what happened? Why did you guys allow affirmative action? Why did you guys allow diversity programs to lead without doing something about it?
Well, I have one response to what you just said, and it's amen that. You mentioned, for example, all of the information that the government has, and I think you're talking about the relative advantages that different peoples or groups of people in this country have received, and who's been excluded. That's absolutely right. And most people aren't aware of all of that. It's like there's a book that I'm sure some of you, if not most of you, are familiar with. I have a copy of it over here. It was written by somebody whom I consider to be a friend and a colleague, Richard Rothstein, The Color of Law. And it talks about how communities came to look the way they do around this country. Those of us who are lawyers, in many of the cases that I've litigated, we've kind of reconstructed that in cases before courts, hoping that they would do something about it. Often they don't. But most people aren't aware of how the United States really created the suburbanization process of America in a way that benefited white Americans post-World War II and completely wrote Black and brown people out by explicit government policies that were discriminatory. That's the basis of a lot of the wealth that exists in this country. People's wealth, been created through their homes. I keep getting all these phone calls. I got one just before we started from my mortgage company telling me that I can tap into my equity in my home, and they want me to do it because they'll make money off of me in doing it or whatever. But that's wealth. So, you see the point. Most people have no idea how all of this inequity is created, this inequality is created. And we have to make all of that clear and then pursue agendas that are aimed at evening out the field that we find ourselves on.
That's right.
One last question. The Native Americans have programs that have benefited some of their leaders. I don't think it has benefited their population, their communities, but they have got some aggressive programs in the SBA and the 8A program that have made millionaires, billionaires. When are we going to insist, or at least invite them to the conversation so that we can participate in some of the programs that have benefited some, if not many of the programs for their communities? Because I think if we could participate there, it could really create some wealth in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
Well, point taken. And, it's obvious that you've been thinking about this and are thinking about it for a while. And so, I just encourage you to continue to make that point and push that agenda, and to invite folks to the table who have had some success and how to do that. Because the reality continues to be that for African Americans, at least, and I keep saying Black and brown people and all the complexities that brings with us, both within the what we call the Black or African American community and outside of it. But the point I'm making is this: is that we African Americans, those of us who are African Americans, we still are at the back of the line in many ways And it's because we haven't been able to find our way to do what other groups of people do and have done and are doing. And so I hope you continue to push that agenda.
I'd like to invite Raul Salinas, General Counsel of the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, also co-host of our conversation today, into the conversation. Raul?
Thank you, Samantha. Enjoy your comments, Professor Shaw. Sandra Day O'Connor and the Bollinger decision dealing with admissions in Michigan in a 2003 decision said that while she supported preferential treatment in college admissions, she would expect that in 25 years, that need would go away. Was she right? Not in the sense that the harms have been addressed, but that the universities have figured a way to allow for diversity. Listening to you, I'm curious about what universities do if we receive an adverse decision to maintain diversity, and how does that play out for chambers like the Black Chamber, the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, where we represent 4.4 million Hispanic businesses? That would be my question for you.
Well, there's a whole lot that should be said in response to what you just said. It's a very rich set of comments and questions. What Justice O'Connor said, first of all, I have long thought about terminology. I don't accept the term preferential treatment when we're talking about getting to the table people who have been excluded and discriminated against, and we're talking about deliberate efforts to include them. That's not a preference. In my view, that is a conscious effort to be inclusive. But having said that, when Justice O'Connor wrote what she wrote about 25 years, my reaction was, now, where does that come from? What in the experience of African Americans, of Hispanic / Latinx people in this country, what tells us that the inequality that has taken in the instance of African Americans, but also of people who are from the Hispanic / Latinx community, what tells us that after these 400 years or so, we're going to solve these problems and resolve them in 25 years? My reaction was that was fanciful at best. I don't have time to go into it, but the bottom line when we talk about African Americans is that if we go back to their first presence in what's now the United States and count the years of legalized subordination, slavery, the continuum through slavery to the Jim Crow experience, right on up through the 1960s. That's a continuum. You can't say it was it ended 150 years ago, because it didn't. It was a continuum. Close to 90% of the days of African Americans in what's now the United States have been spent under Jim Crow segregation, going back to slavery, in that continuum. To think that we're going to end that in 25 years. Well, let me just say this. Justice O'Connor actually backed away from that expectation. She and one of her former law clerks wrote a book called The Next 25 Years. I have it over here. And she backed away from that. Most people ignore that or don't know about it, et cetera. Look what's happened in those 25 years or almost 25 years now. Look at what's happened in the criminal justice system and law enforcement, all of the violence against unarmed Black people the George Floyd moments, but so many others that continue on, including this Black woman who was shot through the door in Florida just a couple of days ago. Are you kidding me? Are we in colorblind America in spite of all of the progress we've made? And we've made a lot of progress, but we're not there yet. We're not nearly there. So you get me started on that and I keep going.
Well, let's, oh no, go ahead.
My hope is that when it comes to, people who are, Hispanic, when it comes to the Latinx community, that their numbers will be or are so large that you can't treat them the way people have treated them in the past. That discrimination becomes a way of cutting the throats of the larger communities. If you hear what I'm saying.
Yep.
But we have to treat Black folk right too. And there's a long history that still needs to be righted.
Well, let's keep going, but let's bring Ted Archer into the conversation. Ted, I see your hand up. And Ted is Executive Director and Head of Business Diversity for JP Morgan Chase. Hi, Ted.
Hey, Samantha, thank you so much for an excellent session. Professor Shaw, this has been really just brilliant, and really just appreciate your insights. So I'll ask a question quickly, because I think you addressed a lot of the questions that many of us maybe had coming into this. But you did two things. One, you gave us a great quote, which was altruism is good, but self-interest is more reliable, which I'm going to keep with me for a long time. But you also mentioned just this concept of progress not being linear, there being fits and starts, right? You have progress and you have some backlash. You can go back as go to the Bakke case and then up through the Croson decision, and then in 2003 the Bollinger decision. In terms of this notion that whether it's the public sector at the state level, the federal level, you have corporations that have a role to play in advancing kind of race consciousness in hiring and business practices. Are there any sort of nuances that we should pay attention to, or are there any sort of advantages that, let's say, a state government may have versus a nonprofit who's kind of mission oriented and more race conscious, and clarifying how they plan to continue to address race in hiring decisions and advancing their own programs to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion? Should we be looking to any one of those sectors, or trying to find ways that we may be able to sort of address what's coming down the pike, knowing that this isn't a linear progression, that there may be some fits and starts?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's, I used to think of it as being linear, but that was naive, fits and starts, you're right. And often reversals, unfortunately. The one thing that this country understands, for better and worse, I didn't say better or worse, I said for better and worse, is money. Look at what, and I'm not talking about the merits of it. You can have whatever thoughts you may have about the merits of it. Look at just what happened with, the PGA and LIV. A lot of people are really angry. A lot of people are saying, on the other hand, that it was inevitable. Yes, there are people who lost loved ones in 9/11, and their voices are being raised in reaction to this decision. And at the same time, though, the PGA says it's business. It's money. We can't do anything else but this. What I'm saying is that first of all, this country can't exist right now, can't function, even though we're dishonest about it, without the Hispanic slash Latinx community. Can't do it. And I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. So as a matter of self-interest, we need to recognize that and embrace not only people who have been in this country for generations upon generation as equal, but also embrace immigrants who come from Mexico and Central and South America and other places. And there's a lot. I say that knowing that even between, in some places, I lived in LA for a few years, I could talk about this experience. The African American community and the Mexican American community have been at odds. We don't, it's not that we are immune to racism and discrimination within and between our communities. But we have to recognize, as I said, those self-interest agendas. I think that stuff is pretty clear to me. Why it isn't clear more broadly, I'm not smart enough to figure out.
That's the first untrue thing you've said of the day, Professor Shaw, but we'll take it. Sadly, our hour is about to come to an end, so we're going to have to pause the questions there, but I think it goes without saying, just the group of leaders on this phone and what we're hearing from the conversation today, that this is the first and not a last of these conversations and figuring out where we go from here and what we do about it. Professor Shaw, your knowledge, expertise, experience, and perspective are unique and immensely valuable. So on behalf of everyone, thank you for all you're doing, all you've done, and spending the time with us today. I'll tell you, as I think about where we go and what we do, there's a couple things that I'm taking away with me. The first is how important it is that we put this in context, that yes, these are major decisions that are coming down, but that they are part of a line and a lineage of decisions and of what has happened in the world or not happened in the country since they've been made. And that when we think about what to do with them, we shouldn't only look at what happens presumably in the next few weeks, but we need to look at the whole. The second is that we gotta be creative. That we have to be ready to think in ways we may not have thought before about how, no matter what the decisions say, the state of play doesn't roll back, only moves forward and continues to progress. And then lastly, that never forget that self-interest is key. And so when we're telling the story, we always have to start with what is moral and what is right, period. But that next sentence needs to be about how this is benefiting the whole. So you talk about the racial wealth gap as one example. We don't want to stop there and talking about how the impact that has impacted Black folks, et cetera. We want to talk about the fact as well that there have been $16 trillion at least lost to the entire American economy as the impact of racial disparities, right? What are the parallels in thinking about what affirmative action has meant for us, but also what affirmative action has meant for the entire community and the economy as a whole. So with that, I will turn it over again with thanks to you, Professor Shaw, to Rep.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sam. And I will be quick, but thank you, Sam, for being an amazing partner on this and the Business and Democracy Initiative. You all are fancy lawyers. I'm an organizer. Sam was saying it in a fancy way. I'll say it plain. There is a group of people on the other side of this that are organizing to make these things happen, right? Like this sort of attack that we were saying doesn't happen without a lot of money and a lot of people being organized. And so there is a great opportunity for us to continue to organize and be creative, as Sam was talking about. And we're committed here to working with all of our partners on the line. And I just want to thank Tammy and my amazing team for working with all of the amazing partners, USBC, NMSDC, and GLCC, BEA. I'm sure I forgot someone getting out quick, but thank you to everyone. And with that, just want to turn the program over to a great partner in this work and a new amazing leader who's now been at the helm about a year of the National Minority Supplier Development Council, and a friend and colleague who will close us out. So over to you, Ms. Ying McGuire.
Well, thank you, Red. And Professor Shaw, Samantha, what an amazing conversation. I learned quite a bit. Also, we have a few more questions I see Beatrice and Sharon and Daryl. Maybe you can put a question in the chat, and maybe Tammy, we can respond to them via email. That would be great. And thank you so much for joining us today for this very important discussion on the critical intersection of Supreme Court, affirmative action, diverse businesses, entrepreneurs. And thank you, Dred, Reimagine Main Street and PPS for making this happen, and all the partners that you mentioned. And through this conversation, Professor, you made very clear, and Samantha, what's at risk from these decisions on affirmative action extends far beyond education. It's a business. So for us who are fighting for economic justice, we understand that access to opportunity is a livelihood, it's a lifeblood of any thriving economy. So it's very crucial that we foster an environment that empowers, support all entrepreneurs, and regardless of their background. A common good friend of ours, Candace, passed away a few weeks ago, and she once said to me, access to capital is bridge, and access to contract is sustainability. So we need to really work on that sustainability. As a CEO of NMSDC, I want to reaffirm our commitment to advancing economic opportunities for Black and Brown people. And we're committed to responding appropriately when the court decisions are handed down. I see our regional council presidents, many of them. I see Beatrice and Sharon, Margot, Brian, Patricia, Francisca, and Terry, they're all on the call. And as a united front, I encourage each one of you to remain engaged, informed, and passionate about the challenges and opportunities we have discussed today. And Red mentioned, the other side is organizing it. So we have to get organized. So let us not forget the power of our collective voice and the impact we can make when we work together. Through our advocacy, we can really shape a future where all entrepreneurs have opportunities to succeed. And thanks once again for your participation and for your unwavering dedication. Together, we can create a more equitable and a prosperous future for all. And let's continue our discussion. Thank you so much for listening.